let me address some of the ways that fermentation transforms foods. I'm just going to start with flavor because it's the flavor of fermentation that first caught my attention. Fermentation creates compelling flavors. You walk into a gourmet food store anywhere, and what you're going to find primarily are products of fermentation. Many foods that maybe you haven't even thought of as fermented are products of fermentation. Almost every individual in almost every part of the world eats and drinks products of fermentation every day. Bread is fermented, cheese is fermented, cured meats are fermented. All the condiments that we might put on our sandwiches involve fermentation in that they rely upon vinegar to stabilize them. Coffee is fermented, chocolate is fermented, vanilla is fermented, certain styles of tea are fermented, alcoholic beverages are all fermented. Sauerkraut, kimchi, and pickles are fermented. Fermentation is really everywhere. It creates these compelling flavors. Not everybody loves every flavor of fermentation. Many of them are what could be described as acquired tastes, and not everybody necessarily acquires every taste of fermentation. And certain flavors of fermentation are really only accessible to people who have been exposed to them from early on in their lives. But fermentation creates compelling flavors, and once you sort of learn to appreciate a flavor of fermentation, they tend to be flavors that we keep on seeking out. As you could notice in any cheese store. The stinkier cheeses, not everybody loves, but the people who love them are very, very devoted to them, and keep on coming back and buying more cheese. So flavor, I think we just have to start with flavor. Then beyond flavor, preservation. For us in the 21st century with our refrigerators and freezers, it's hard to appreciate, just how important fermentation has been to food preservation. But most of us can't even imagine, how we could feed ourselves without a refrigerator. What do you do with your perishable foods? But obviously, if we were having, this conversation 100 years ago, none of us would have refrigerators. Then we might think about canning as a method that people use to preserve food, an old-time method of preserving food. But it turns out that canning is a 200-year-old technology. The patent was issued in 1812 in France to Nicolas Appert, and in France they still call canning appertisation because they remember the name of the person who invented this clever process of sterilizing food inside of a jar. If you remove refrigerators, freezers, and sterilizing food in a jar, there are not many methods of food preservation. You can dry food. Drying works not by sterilizing the food like canning does, but rather by depriving the microorganisms present on the food of the water that they need in order to function. And the other way that people have historically preserved food is using fermentation, and specifically the acidification that results from many fermentation processes in order to preserve the food. So examples of this would include the fermentation of vegetables like we'll be doing today, and that's through the fermentation lactic acid develops, and it's the lactic acid that stabilizes the vegetables. And in our contemporary society, most of us might store the sauerkraut in the refrigerator because we have one, but whenever you hear the stories of agrarian people in temperate places trying to survive through a long winter without refrigeration, sauerkraut is a survival food. Cheese and yogurt and kefir and all the other forms of fermented milk are all strategies for preserving milk. Salamis and other kinds of cured meats are strategies for preserving meat. So fermentation has been very important throughout history, to our ability to, preserve, the overabundance that happens at certain times of the year to feed us through the periods of relative scarcity.